All right, folks, welcome back to the Squats and Sober Thoughts podcast. This is your host, Max LaRock. This is the first ever video style pod that I will now be doing moving forward. So, this is a full new revamp. We've got quite a few weeks, if not actually months at this point, that we got to play some catch up on. We're going to start with some appreciation, some gratitude, and then I'm going to play a little catch up with how I'm feeling from a personal standpoint, from a business standpoint, and just a few things that I'm going through. So, for those who follow along on social media, I bought a house. If you couldn't tell, I was kind of hinting at it in the last podcast with Daniel Yorez there, and obviously at that point, the day that we recorded that was utter chaos. It was the day that we were actually closing the sale, and it was a very high stress situation. So to say the least, I was a little discombobulated on that podcast. So appreciate you, Dan, and yeah, appreciate your patience with me. But regardless, we are here and we are back. As you can see, if you're watching on YouTube or watching in video format in any capacity, this is my new office. So I have some big aspirations for this room. One of the goals of the podcast is actually to be having guests come to the house. So I'd like to create a dedicated space for the podcast moving forward so that I can have guests for in-person podcasts, which I think will help create a lot more depth with some of the conversations that I'd like to have. And I just think it's a really cool thing to work towards. I really want to push the podcast moving forward, and obviously having the space to do so now and not have a baby, two babies above me, being a little bit more in control of the noise and things like that is going to be helpful in that sense. So that is something that I want to push, and you will see this room change drastically moving forward. So pretty excited for everything to come with the podcast. But truth be told, this is an accomplishment and achievement that had you told me I would be purchasing a house 4 years ago, I would have laughed in your face. There's no way in fucking hell I would have ever thought that this was going to be capable. So I am incredibly proud of myself and the work that I've done from a sobriety standpoint, from a mental health standpoint, the investment that I've made into working with Stu as diligently as I have, my psychologist for the last 2 years, the breathwork sessions that I've done for the last year and a half now, just all of the personal development, all of the books, everything that I've done. I'm really not good at recognizing myself for the work that I do and giving myself props for the work that I do. But I think something about having the house and having this physical space now be a literal tangible accomplishment that's feels like it's in my hands now is something that I just can't negate, and I want to give myself props for that. So I am incredibly proud of myself. I'm incredibly grateful for each and every one of you clients of mine who have worked with me over the last 4 years, who have referred me to friends, referred me to family, or referred me to their partners, whatever that looks like. If you're a supporter of the gym, if you're a member, if you bring Lucy dog treats and save me money there, whatever that looks like, I just want to say thank you. I literally would not be here if it was not for you. So yeah, just want to say I'm very grateful for each and every one of you, whether you've physically or financially supported my business, if you've ever shared an Instagram post, if you've ever told a friend about me, it all helps. So I can't thank you enough. Another huge accomplishment for me as of more recent is I am now at 5.5 months or 5.5 months sober from THC, which is another accomplishment that I honestly didn't believe would have been possible. I've, in my adult life, since I was 18 years old, have not been sober from all substances for this long. So I am incredibly proud of that. The longest stint I had prior to this was just shy of 90 days. And as I've talked about on previous podcasts, once I do it once, I kind of open the floodgates and I have a hard time really back. So the fact that I am now 5.5 months, closing in on 6 months, THC free is something that I would have never imagined was possible. So I am very proud of myself for that. On top of that, I also had the best year of business I've ever had in my entire life. So once again, gratitude for each and every one of you. I feel like I'm bragging a little bit, but that's not the intent here. It's more or less just to practice recognizing my achievements, because it's something that I have minimized for most of my life, if not all of my life, to be blatantly honest. And I'm just proud of that. I set a target last year to save a certain amount of income each month to make this dream happen, and I didn't really think it was achievable. And so, moral of the story, set high goals for yourself, and you never know what you might accomplish. So, yeah. Now, to catch you up on more recent, it is January 20th today, and I've been trying to post this for a couple days now, dealing with a little bit of technical issues as I'm trying to revamp this and transition to a more video style. I also have been just getting in my own way as the perfectionist that I am. And I've talked about this ad nauseum at this point on other podcasts and other individuals' podcasts. But perfectionism sucks. And so I kind of want to tie this in with some of the emotions that I am struggling with right now. And a lot of this kind of came to light as of recent, actually. So I was listening to the Chris Williamson podcast where he had his guest Connor Beaton on, who is a therapist. He works predominantly with men. His Instagram handle is Man Talks. He talks about a lot of really good stuff and how emotions are our guidebook and our body actually tells us more than what our brain tells us. Our brain is typically just a lot louder than what our body is because a lot of us are so suppressed and so out of tune and out of sync with our bodies that we don't really do a good job from an intuitive standpoint of listening to what our body is trying to tell us. And so he talked a lot about grief and how grief is around any sort of big transition in life. Now, typically we look at grief or we think of grief as loss. It's loss of a relationship, it's loss of a loved one, loss of a career, whatever it may be. But grief can actually be wrapped up in something that's more positive. And so he used himself as an example where a few years prior, he had recently gotten married, his wife was pregnant with their first child, his businesses were growing and thriving and he was killing it. And he just felt this immense sadness all the time. And he didn't realize it until it was a mentor of his that talked to him about the fact that you can actually grieve positive transitions in your life. And so what he was getting at was, or what he was grieving at the time, was essentially the fact that he had escaped alcoholism. His mom died of alcoholism, and he thought that he was destined to go down a road of alcoholism and substance abuse, and his life would never actually be where it was at that point in time. And it made me think that with some of the emotions that I've been feeling as of recent, I think I'm actually in a pretty similar state right now. Because the last few weeks have been really, really difficult for me, even amidst these massively positive changes. And truthfully, that's why I wanted to start on a positive note here, because as of recent, I've had a really hard time being positive, being optimistic, seeing all the positive progress and positive change that's happened in my life. And I think some of it is understanding that there is a grieving of my old self that has to be let go of and be accepted, that I'm not who I used to be and I'm not who I had thought that I was going to be in my future life. And I don't want to say that I had labeled myself as a loser, but I think I kept my expectations so low and my standards so low that I really didn't have goals for myself. And I think that when I was struggling with alcoholism and addiction in general and just low self-worth, it was easier to not have high standards because then it allowed me to manage my expectations of failure a lot better. And I think better might not be the right word here, but it was just easier to embrace not succeeding in business, not succeeding in my sobriety, not succeeding in my relationships. And I think I'm having to accept that that's not who I am deep down, and I actually have high standards for myself and I have the ability to achieve those high standards, but I have to not only put in the work but have the belief within myself that I'm worthy of those high standards. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about too is with this longest stint of sobriety, I actually feel like, which might be tied to the grieving that I have not done yet, but I actually feel like I'm dealing with a little bit of depression for the first time in my life. And I'm not saying this publicly from a sort of a victim standpoint or anything like that. it's more or less just acknowledging that I may have struggled with this in the past, but because I was always under the influence of alcohol and or drugs, I never really labeled it as depression. I never really thought that I was a depressed person, even though I was using substance every single day of the week, which typically isn't happening from someone who isn't depressed or anxious or anything along those lines. So, yeah, and the reason I say this is that just for the last few weeks, even though there's been a lot of massively positive change, I've just felt exhausted. I've had zero sense of creative spark. I have had a really hard time finding enjoyment in just about anything, and I kind of almost forget what joy feels like. And it's just been kind of eye-opening. So, truth be told, I also have not been able to see Stu, my psychologist, in the last 2 months here, and that's the longest break I've taken from seeing him. And he is obviously a massive support in my life, but it's the longest break I've taken from seeing him in the last 2 years. So I do have a session booked with him 2 weeks from now, which I'm very much looking forward to. And I think I just need to express a lot of the things that are going on with me. And I think there's an element of also accepting that on top of the positive grief I'm dealing with, I think that over the last few months, I haven't properly grieved the ending of my last relationship. So I was quite distraught at the end of that relationship. There was an immense amount of guilt wrapped up in the ending of that relationship, and the immense amount of guilt that I had put on myself due to the fact that I know that a lot of the relationship struggles that we went through were tied to my addiction, and I didn't tell her about those things, and there's a lot of guilt and sadness wrapped up in that. And so I think the two have just started to weigh on me, both the negative grieving, or the sad grieving we can say, and the positive grieving that has not happened yet. And so I kind of threw myself into the dating pool once again shortly thereafter the relationship ended, because I wasn't ready to really accept it and deal with it for what it was. And I think there's an element of me that definitely avoided the grieving process through achievement and through occupying my time with purchasing the house and throwing myself into work. I started that 12-week challenge at the beginning of September, which was like 2 weeks after the breakup, and a large part of that was to deflect from some of the feelings that I was experiencing. So that is something that I'm currently kind of struggling with and just trying to wrap my head around. Again, I've never been this clear-headed for my entire adult life, so I feel like I now have enough time away from substance to properly start dealing with some of these emotions and sitting with the emotions that come with this. So yeah, that's where I'm at with that. It's been a tough couple weeks, to say the least. So one of the things that I have been doing as of the last week was I actually deleted all dating apps from my phone. I could tell that I was definitely using dating apps as a very deflective behavior. And I sort of had this thought process that as much as I was sober from substance, I was not sober from my disassociative and distractive behaviors. So I deleted those, and it's kind of shown a light on me in showing that there is a fair bit of loneliness that's actually been happening and been experiencing on my end. So yeah, I just wanted to come out here and talk about that and express that. One of the things they also spoke about in that podcast was differentiating explaining versus expressing. So if you do follow me on social media, I had made a post last Friday talking about a goal of mine for this year is to get better at expressing how I'm feeling instead of explaining how I'm feeling. Obviously, in my role as a coach, I like to think of myself as being very good at explaining myself and explaining things and concepts and feelings to people, but not actually expressing these things to people, loved ones, partners, friends, whatever it may be. And yeah, I'm just trying to find and sit with myself for long enough to be able to express how I'm feeling about everything as a whole. So, to catch you up a little bit on the perfectionist side of things. So, one of the things I also did was that I deleted the old editing app that I was using previously for the podcast. Reason being, is a large reason why I wasn't staying consistent with the podcast was that I was letting my perfectionist tendencies take over the editing process as a whole. So if you have listened to prior podcasts of mine, whether you actually pay attention to it or not in terms of the details, which probably no one does because it's really only my perfectionist self that's so hypercritical about them. But for every podcast that was roughly an hour long, I was editing for, at minimum, 6 upwards of 12 hours per episode, which is absolutely fucking obnoxious, considering there is, on average, 75 to 100 listens. This is a free medium where I'm just here to have conversations, talk about coaching, express my feelings, express my thoughts, express my experiences. It makes no sense whatsoever to be putting that much time and effort into editing when it's just not necessary. And to be quite frank, between my online coaching business, between my co-ownership of the gym, between being a single dog dad to an active dog, between now owning a house and the responsibilities that come with the house with shoveling and all of the things, I don't have the time to commit 6 to 12 hours a week to record and edit a podcast. And it simply doesn't make sense. So I was getting in my own way because I was getting so hyper fixated on the editing process that I was cutting out whenever someone would say like, or if they would excessively say like, if they would say if they would say if they would say right. All of these things that we use when we talk as human beings, I was trying to make it so quote unquote perfect that I was eliminating all of the language that we would use. Sorry, Lucy's now in the room and she's distracting me. And I'm not going to be editing this motherfucker, because that's basically what I'm going at with this, is that moving forward, I want to stay consistent with the podcast, but the only way for me to do that is going to be posting it in a much more raw and unfiltered manner. And I think this is going to be good in a variety of different ways, because it's going to allow me to get over myself and stop hyper-fixating on how I speak, and stop judging how I speak, and stop judging how others speak. And to be quite honest, like, I understand how judgmental that sounds, and I'm not proud of that, but I am owning up to it because it was something that was basically crippling me from ever growing this podcast. Because I can't afford to pay an editor, and even then, an editor is not going to fucking go in and cut out likes, rights. But a large element was that all of the guests that I've had on have been phenomenal guests. They've all had great messages, whatever their message may be. Some of them just didn't articulate it as well as I would have, not that as much as I would have liked, but I wanted to make sure that people got the most out of their message, and so I tried to perfect it for them by cutting out likes, rights, and it was just unreasonable. And I'm not going to fucking do that anymore. So if you are a listener, or at this point a viewer of the podcast, if I say like, right, a lot, I apologize. A goal with this as well is to actually work on my speaking in general and just get better at articulating how I feel. And a large part of that is going to be being less reactive when I speak and being more intentional with how I speak, and trying to not necessarily eliminate those words, but lessen the frequency at which I use those words. Because I don't like when I sound inarticulate, and it's something I want to work towards. So one could argue that that's probably the perfectionist in me wanting that, striving for that, but at the same time, I want to be in a position where when this podcast grows, because it will, I want to make sure that I do sound professional and that I get my message across as cleanly and concisely as possible. So that is that in regards to that. I think that's actually pretty much everything that I want to talk about in this episode, because I'm going to be doing this every week. I have a big year-long calendar in front of me. You can't see it on the wall behind you if you're viewing this, but I'm going to be putting a little X on every single day I do a podcast, and the goal is to do at minimum 52 podcasts per this year. So one per week. It's January 20th, so obviously I'm going to be doing some catch up here in the next couple of weeks. Some of them are going to be short, some are going to be long. Again, I'm excited for everyone who is following along, because you're going to see this room change a lot over the years to come, and I'm even more excited to be able to bring on guests to the show who are in the Edmonton area to actually come speak in person. I do think it'll help with the depth of the conversation, just the authenticity of the conversation. It helps with body language. There isn't that awkward sort of delay, that lag of, are they going to say something on Zoom? You never really know. But yeah, either way, I'm very excited to grow the podcast and put out a good message, talk about fitness, talk about my feelings, talk about what I'm going through, talk about what comes up in therapy and breath work, and talk about things with professionals and of a variety of different careers, and just see what comes of this. So if you are following along in any way, shape, or form, I appreciate you. If you've been patient with my many infrequent attempts at becoming consistent with this podcast, hopefully this new format allows me to do so. As mentioned, it's going to be unedited, so if there's ever any sort of long pauses, it's because I'm trying to avoid saying certain words, and I'm trying to be more intentional with it. But either way, I appreciate you. This is Season 6, Episode 1 of the Squats and Sober Thoughts podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next few days with some more words of wisdom, or potentially just catching you up on what I'm going through. But either way, it's Monday, so I hope you have a fucking fantastic Monday.